a spy-infested village, Olympic spirits, scholarly NPCs. Learn how to use these in your campaigns.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, I have another amazing interview coming right up. But first, if you need some help running games and you want to cut down your prep time, I make resource books that help you do that. You can find them at dicegeeks.com, drivethrurpg.com, or amazon.com. You can just type in Dice Geeks, all one word, or the Book of Random Tables. All of my stuff should come up. They will help you cut down your prep time, have more fun at the table, and you will not regret checking them out, if I do say so myself. All right, enough of the pretentious announcer. Here's today's interview. My guest today is the writer and game designer behind the Molten Sulfur blog, Tristan Zimmerman. Tristan, it is good to have you back on the show again.
Matt, always a delight to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a lot of fun conversations about history and RPGs. Why don't you just remind everybody about Molten Sulfur and your RPG that you kickstarted a few months back?
Matt keeps asking me here because of the Molten Sulfur blog, where every week I put out RPG content pulled from real history and folklore, cool stuff that's interesting and worth learning about in its own right. And then I talk about how to file the serial numbers off of it and drop it into the campaign you're already running. And then, a few months ago, I successfully kickstarted an RPG called Shanty Hunters, where you play as people collecting magical sea shanties in the year 1880. And probably by the time this episode drops, it'll be out on drive-thru. So check it out.
Yeah, awesome. And so, congratulations that you were able to pull off a successful Kickstarter, and that is really, really cool. So, as you mentioned, and I'm sure as regular listeners know, we talk about some really interesting historical topics and try to make them gameable. So we're going to talk about Olympic spirits from a grimoire, scholarly NPCs from history. But first, we're going to tackle a spy-infested village, and that's already given me some ideas. So why don't you set up this real village from history, Tristan, and then let us know how we can use this in our games.
Yeah, so the village in question is a village called Montaillou. It's in southern France. We're going to be talking about Montaillou around the year 1300. If the name is kind of ringing a bell for you, you might have read the seminal book about Montaillou if you took many history classes in college, because that book is just kind of a standard for undergrads. And it's a standard for a reason. It's really good, and the content is super interesting. So first, to set the stage, in the 1200s, so, the century preceding when we're looking at, the area of southern France really kind of became synonymous with a religion called Catharism. And the Catholic Church saw Catharism as heresy, as a Christian heresy. And from 1209 to 1229, the church waged a crusade in southern France to stamp out Catharism. This crusade has been called by some historians the first ideological genocide. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. This was absolutely a war fought to exterminate a religion, and honestly, it was pretty successful, as evidenced by the fact that there's not really any Cathars around today. So in Montaillou, the crusade didn't kind of get as far west as Montaillou, but the religion of Catharism could no longer be practiced openly by the time period that we're talking about, right? So whereas before you had Cathar preachers, reading publicly from Cathar holy books and doing sermons and so forth, by this point, Catharism really could only be taught in kind of hushed conversations around the fireside. A little bit about what Catharism is. We are right now in the middle of kind of a historical reinterpretation of what the major tenets of Catharism were. There does not seem to be any debate about like Catharism really was a thing. Kind of from where I'm sitting, the debate is over kind of little niggling things. But anyway, it's a big thing right now in this particular branch of history. So I just want to throw that asterisk on there. But it looks like Catharism was a dualist religion. It taught that there were two gods, a good God who made, souls in the spiritual world, and an evil God who made flesh and people and the world, well, the flesh of people, but, animals and the world and things you could touch. And that we all are trapped in an endless circle of reincarnation in this awful, sinful, suffering world that the good God wants to get us out of. And the way that you can escape is interesting. The Cathars had this religious ritual called the consolamentum, which the Catholic Church called hereticization. And when you undergo the consolamentum, you become free of sin. And if you die while sinless, you get to escape the cycle of rebirth. So you had these people, these Cathar kind of priests called perfects who underwent the consolamentum and then had to remain sinless. And there was a bunch of things they had to make sure they didn't do in order not to sin. Kind of chief among those was they had to be vegetarians because eating meat was fundamentally sinful. And they had to be chaste because sex was fundamentally sinful. And the primary duty of a perfect was to go around the countryside performing the consolamentum for Cathars who were dying. And what would happen is, as you lay on your deathbed, a perfect would come to you. He would perform the consolamentum. He or she, it seems to be the case that perfects could be both men and women. The perfect would perform the consolamentum for you, and then you would stop eating. Right. And the idea was you would lie in your deathbed and you would not eat, and you would intentionally starve yourself to death. And in so doing, you wouldn't have the opportunity to commit any sins, and you would die sinless and you would escape. Now, here in Montaillou by 1300, it seems pretty clear that Catharism had regressed, right? And this is kind of unavoidable when your religion can no longer be taught publicly, can no longer be debated or discussed. When all of the people who know the fine ins and outs of Catharism and read enough Latin to be able to read the Cathar holy books were executed first by the Crusade and then by the Inquisition. And so Catharism by this point in Montaillou, it seems to be the case that it was now believed that women could not be perfects, and in fact that women were now seen as so debased and so sinful that even if they received the consolamentum on their deathbed, they would still be sinful enough that they would not be able to escape from reincarnation. And if they were very lucky, they would be able to reincarnate as a man. And if they weren't lucky, or if they didn't receive the consolamentum, they would reincarnate as an animal and have to continue working their way back up. So by this point, what you have is a bunch of the old people in this village are still diehard Cathars, and the younger people sort of follow a debased or lessened version of their own religion. And this is an issue because the Catholic Church is maintaining an inquisition in southern France in order to stamp out the last vestiges of Catharism. And that's actually where we get this incredible textual source that lets us know so much about what is going on in Montaillou. Because the guy who is in charge of, and I think we may have talked about this guy before on the podcast, but the guy who's in charge of this particular branch of the Inquisition is writing everything down. So he's bringing in all these peasants and being like, hey, we're going to conduct an interview here because you have evidence that one of your neighbors may be a Cathar. And the interviewee is reporting things, and it's all being written down, and we still have the documents, right? And this is the oldest record of ordinary people speaking in their own words. And because they're speaking in their own words, the oldest surviving record, because they're speaking in their own words, we get all these incredible details about what life is like. And we happen to have kind of an overrepresentation of folks from Montaillou. So getting into Montaillou, Montaillou, the village, now that we have all of this background, Montaillou, the village is really just a fabulous adventure site. It's on the slopes of the Pyrenees Mountains, the mountains that separate Spain from France, and it's located on top of a hill. And at the top of the hill, you have this piddly little castle. It's just kind of like a squat tower. And then around, further down the hill from the castle, you have the actual village. And there's no wall around the village, but the village is built so that the houses are in tiers and they kind of all touch each other. So as you're approaching the village, you are faced with a wall. It's not a village wall or anything. It's just all of the huts of the village are just touching one another, like a line of row houses facing out. And then because they're on a hill, each successive line of houses overlooks the row before that. So it's kind of this very imposing warren as you're approaching it, that while the village was not fortified, did mean that in case of an attack, it was hard enough to get into the village that the villagers could escape up the hill and into the castle to the comparative safety there. Also, because all of these houses are touching one another, there's all these secret passages in the village, right? Where, hey, my house and your house share a wall, and we have a door between our houses, but we cover it up so nobody knows that we have a door and we can freely pass between them. And this was actually a very important way that the Cathars in Montaillou, because not everybody in Montaillou was a Cathar, a lot of folks were Catholics. This was an important way that the Cathars in Montaillou could remain in surreptitious religious contact with one another through these secret doorways. I love the secret doorways. While we're talking about the houses themselves, I'll also mention that the roof tiles in these houses, they had flat roofs with wooden tiles, but the tiles were not nailed down. For economic reasons that we'll get to in a minute, which meant that because the houses were low and the roofs were flat and the tiles were not nailed down, it was really easy to spy on your neighbors, because all you had to do was stand right next to their house and lift up the roof tile and you could see right into their house and spy on them. And that was really relevant because everybody was reporting on everybody else to the Inquisition, because that was a way that you could avenge perceived wrongs, right? If your neighbor did something that you oh, that's a dick move, I'm going to get back at them. Well, there's a really easy way to do it. Run off to the Inquisition in nearby Carcassonne and tell the Inquisition, hey, did you know my neighbor's a Cathar? I saw them doing this Cathar stuff. And the Inquisition will roll into the village and have a lot of questions for your neighbor. So everybody's spying on everybody else, and everybody's got all of these these perceived slights against one another because welcome to humans living together in close quarters.
Yeah, make sure your dog doesn't bark at midnight or something like that.
Exactly, right. And also, like, if even you can report not just your living neighbors, you can also report your dead neighbors, right? Hey, just thought you might want to know their dead grandma was a Cathar, because now the Inquisition is going to roll into town and be like, hey, let me investigate. Was she a Cathar? If she's a Cathar, we're going to dig her up from the graveyard because she can't be buried in consecrated earth. And so you have these two sides, and there are diehard Cathars and there are diehard Catholics, and there's a lot of people in between, because Catharism is kind of, or seems to have been in this period, kind of a sliding scale between Catholicism and Catharism. And these guys in the middle, maybe they don't adhere super strongly to either side, but they're happy to play either side, depending on how useful or convenient it is to them. Let's see here. The land around Montaillou is really interesting, because you have the fields around the village, of course, because everybody in the village more or less farms. And then beyond the fields, you have the grassy slopes of the Pyrenees, where there are shepherds. And the shepherds don't really live anywhere. They're almost all unmarried men, and they just go as they please. And they go up and down the length of the foothills, and they cross over the Pyrenees into Spain, and they come and go everywhere. And they're living kind of this wild pastoral existence. And they are the ones who know everything, because they're constantly bouncing from village to village and across the mountains. And they're the ones who are really connected in and know what's happening everywhere. And they even had the system of specialized whoops that they would use to communicate with one another across valleys, which I think is just wild.
Yeah.
And then beyond the pastures, you have the forests and caves of the Pyrenees, which were home to wolves and to the last surviving Cathar perfects. And I'll get to that in a minute. One final mention about Montaillou, and the agricultural and economic thing, is that everybody is desperately poor. There are 40 homes in the village. Only 3 of them have a second story. There was not a single cart in the whole village. Nobody owned enough stuff that a cart would be relevant. It blows my mind, right? A whole village without a cart. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so just everybody is desperately poor, including the guy who lives in the castle, and we'll talk about him more in a minute. Mm-hmm. But his castle, he doesn't have retainers. He doesn't have, he's a thug with a sword who just lives in a cold, drafty stone box, right? Even though nobility, the noble who's kind of in charge, but kind of not, is desperately poor.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's just fascinating already. I mean, and I know you have a lot more to go, but it's just fascinating already that, well, number one, that 40 or so households, everybody in the village was a spy then, right? Like everybody was spy.
Everybody was spying on everybody else.
Yeah. And that just sets up a dynamic that, it's in practice, right? In actuality, that would be a horrifying existence, right? The thought that, your neighbor next to you, who you've probably known your whole life, it will turn you in at a moment's notice if, your dog is barking, or you spilled some water in front of their doorstep or something like that, that it was just, that's just crazy. And then, of course, kind of the layout of the village, I think that's something that we, I don't know, maybe don't think about a lot when we're running a role-playing game, but like if we set up a village where all the houses touch and there's secret doors and you can lift up a roof tile just to like look in. I mean, those aspects there like could like fuel, I don't know how many sessions of, as the players are talking about their secret plan, you can just have them notice that, somebody's listening through a roof tile that's just lifted up or something like that. I mean, it's just amazing. And I know, like I said, you have a lot more to go, but there are just a ton of aspects already that would make great gameable material.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. One thing about the sleights and the spying that jumped out at me on top of all that is that the sleights weren't always like, oh, yesterday you did a dick move and I'm really mad about it, so today I'm gonna walk 3 days to go report you. Often it would be stuff like, well, you were a dick to me 4 years ago and today you did something so minor that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And so all of a sudden the Inquisition is showing up in your awful tiny little hut being like, hey, we understand that you were that you're a Cathar. And you're racking your brain like, what did I do to anger one of my neighbors? And you can't think of anything because it was years ago, which to me just it creates a sense of paranoia, right? Yeah. Who is watching me? Who has it out for me at all times?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it just reminded me too, when I was reading it on Molten Sulfur, it reminded me, I think it was a couple of years ago, I heard a story about East Germany. That I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was something while the Soviets controlled East Germany, it was something like 1 in 17 or 1 in 14 people were informants or secret agents. And you're just like, what? Like your best friend would be an agent. Like you couldn't trust anybody. I mean, it's just a terrifying way to live, really.
Yeah. I've seen similar numbers of just, you could safely assume not that everyone you met was a Stasi informant, but that someone you knew and someone you were close to was right now reporting on you to the Stasi.
It could be your mom. Like, who even knows, right? Like, I mean, it's crazy. It's just crazy. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Situations like this, it's just almost unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but the political situation in Montaillou, let's talk about the politics kind of above the village level, and then we'll zoom into politics at the village level. I've been talking about Montaillou being in the south of France because today it is. At the time, it wasn't. Montaillou was actually not part of the Kingdom of France. It was part of the County of Foix. And the County of Foix was not part of France. The Count of Foix was not a subject of the King of France. He was the county was fully independent, though admittedly by 1300 he was dependent on the King of France. The reason for which is that the knights who were crusaders in the Albigensian Crusade, the one that came in and killed hundreds of thousands of people, those knights were mostly French. And so if at any point the Count of Foix acted up, right, or did something that would anger the King of France, the King of France could always just conveniently realize that there was a lot more Catharism in Foix than he had realized, and crusade is back on, guys. So the Count of Foix is independent, but he's not fully independent, right? He's definitely got to mind his P's and Q's. Now, Montaillou, of course, the Count of Foix was he had lots of vassals, and these vassals, they controlled their own little fiefs and, all very standard stuff. Montaillou was not one of them. Montaillou was not part of a fief. Montaillou was owned not by a local lord. It was owned directly by the Count of Foix. If he were a king, we would call this crown lands. He was not a king. I'm not sure if there's a word for it in English, what these Montaillou lands were. But I mentioned that there was a knight living up in the castle. He was the castellan, but he was not the local lord. His position was not hereditary. He was appointed to it. And when he died, a new guy was appointed to take over the castle. He had no retainers. He did not get to collect taxes. He got no real benefits from living in Montaillou other than he was told to live here, and he did get a roof over his head, and that was nice. And his job was simply to be the one person in town who owned a sword, so that if the peasants ever started acting up, he could go out there and start killing people. So his role was to be the threat of force in town. Now, there were two different castellans at different points in the era that we're talking about. Both of them were just staggeringly dull, uninteresting people. Little more than thugs with swords. They didn't do anything interesting. They were, however, both married to the same woman. The first one died, and then she remarried to the second one. And she was interesting. Her name was Béatrice de Plenissod. She was a minor member of the aristocracy. Of course, she didn't grow up in Montaillou, God knows. But she did have Cathar sympathies. And in fact, she was childhood friends with these two Cathar missionaries who were still, in the time period we're talking around 1300, these two Cathar missionaries were still traveling around in Foix, and she was still friends with them. After the second husband died, Beatrice moves into just an ordinary house in Montaillou, right? Like I mentioned, even the nobles, the two nobles in this town, still desperately poor. Béatrice de Plenissod, Beatrice, was a noble, but she was living in the same awful one-story house that everybody else was living in. These were not one-room houses for the most part. They did have little, teeny tiny little multiple rooms, but still awful, tiny, cramped, dark, smelly. And she was just living in one of those and carrying on an affair with the village priest. We'll talk more about the village priest in a minute here. But I think this woman is incredibly interesting. She's a Cathar sympathizer who is married to a sequence of Catholic boors and is carrying on an affair with the village priest. So, okay, you have the Castellan, and he's one representative of the Count of Foix, and he's there to crack heads in case anybody gets uppity. The other representative of the Count of Foix is the bailiff, and the bailiff's job was to ensure taxes got collected and conduct arrests in the case of crimes. The bailiff was not a noble. The bailiff was just this guy, a local peasant by the name of Bernard Clergue. He was the brother of the village priest, Pierre Clergue. And so the Clergue family kind of actually ran the village of Montaillou, even though they were a peasant family and barely any wealthier than anybody else in Montaillou. They had a 2-story house. But the bailiff, like, his job was just to be like, okay, was there a crime? Like, I guess I'm going to figure out who we're going to arrest. And if the guy who's going to be arrested didn't want to be arrested, then the bailiff would go to the castle and be like, hey, can you come use that sword, please? And that's just how things were run in Montaillou. So you have these 3 temporal powers, the count, the castellan, and the bailiff. And then you have the church. Now,
sounded like you were going to start a joke there.
So a count, a castellan, and a bailiff go into a desperately poor medieval village.
There you go.
So you have the church, right? And of course, the representative of the church in Montaillou is Pierre Clergue, the local priest. Mm-hmm. The Clergue family are Cathars. The Pierre and Bernard Clergue's parents are diehard Cathars. Pierre is, around 1300, more Cathar than Catholic, even though he is the village priest and responsible for educating his flock to get them to not be Cathars and be Catholics. And he's sleeping with everybody's wives. Okay. Pierre Clergue just nonstop adultery. But every so often, that you will have other representatives of the church roll into town. You may have messengers come in and be like, hello, we're here from the Inquisition. We would like these 3 people to please report to Carcassonne to answer some questions for the Inquisition, if you would be so kind. You'll have friars rolling through, you will have other representatives of the church passing through. But the primary representative of the church, and therefore of the Inquisition, was this serially adulterous Cathar priest, which is incredible.
Very complex. Yes.
Yes. And then we have the perfects. Remember the perfects, the guys, the kind of Cathar priesthood? Now, there were no perfects living in Montaillou. The perfects had to keep moving, right? They couldn't put down roots in any one place because then the Inquisition would get word of it, and that'd be it for the perfect. But we do have 2 perfects operating in and around Montaillou, kind of bouncing from house to house and village to village. And these 2 guys are the worst. They are, kind of Cathars in name only. They really are kind of the last gasp of their religion. One of them was a guy by the name of Prade Tavernier, who did not understand any Latin, so he couldn't read the Cathar holy books. So he was just pretty awful and didn't understand what he was doing. And then the other guy, Guillaume Bellibaste, he had a better handle on the theology, and I believe could understand Latin, but he chose to ignore the theology. He traveled with a female servant that he was just having all of the sex with, even though, of course, perfects had to be chaste. He liked to lecture people about the evils of eating meat, even though, bro, that is a you thing. Perfects can't eat meat. Why are you lecturing us? We're not perfects. It's not a thing for us. And then you did have these 2 Cathar missionaries who would pass through every once in a blue moon. Guillaume was burned by the Inquisition in 1321. I believe he is the only person among all these Cathars that I've been talking about who was deliberately executed by the Inquisition. You had to be real unrepentant during this period, around 1300. You had to be real unrepentant in order to get executed. Of course, rewind 100 years, and you just had to look vaguely Cathar and get killed among the hundreds of thousands of other people. Some of these other people, they got arrested. They got sent to the dungeon in Carcassonne, where they died of disease. Whatever, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. And so, what we have here is we have this village that's built kind of like an anthill, right? It's all interconnected and so forth. Everybody knows everybody else's business. Neighbors are constantly reporting each other to the Inquisition to avenge past wrongs. You've got a handful of Cathar families scheming against the majority of the pseudo Cathar families. You got this hypocritical priest. His family is kind of its own little mini state unto itself, governing Montaillou. Political power is very local in the clerk family and the very boring Castellans, but it's also very far away, right? It's all the way in the seat of the Count of Foix, and what's he going to do, right? Nothing. And everybody's spying on everybody else, and everybody's paranoid, and you got these wild shepherds living in the hills, and everyone is achingly poor. And I just think this is an incredible adventure location.
Yeah, and I was just thinking all you have to do is throw in a group of 5 murder hobos and all heck is going to break loose, right?
Exactly. And to me, what I think this location would work best as is take the adventure you were already going to run and set it in a village based on Montaillou, right? So if you're just running Caves of Chaos or whatever, have the village that everybody comes back to as the home base be based on Montaillou. And that then is going to just super complicate everything that's going on with the adventure that you're running, right? Like, okay, we're going into the dungeon or whatever. And as you're, okay, what do you do in the dungeon? You got this thing going on, and the Cathars would really take it kindly if you do one thing, and the Catholics would take it kindly if you do the other thing. And ta-da, congratulations, all of a sudden you're involved in the politics in this stupid, stupid village. And you did not want to be. That's not why you're here. You're here to kill goblins. But, you know, the Cathars say that, you know, goblins are reincarnated God's creatures, so you have to try to talk to the goblins first. And the Catholics say, oh, no, you got to kill all the goblins. And whichever you do, congratulations, you have just taken a side, and now you've angered the other side, and now the other side is always spying on you and trying to find things that they can report you for. And yeah, just like use this village as a way of complicating the adventure that you already wanted to run.
Yeah, I think that is a great take on it, that you use it just as a complication to whatever you're running already. And I think that's a really interesting idea. And of course, I mean, honestly, you could just, you know, really, like you said, just make that your default kind of starting place of your campaign. That's your setting. Or I think you could slot it in if you have a group of traveling, you know, people. You could just, you know, slot that village in, and maybe after a few days there, they want to get out of there or something. But I think you could use it in a number of ways, and I think it is really interesting. And I mean, there's certainly enough elements in the story that you can pull something out of. Absolutely. What do you think about, is there a way to do it with science fiction, or a different, if somebody's not playing like a straight fantasy game?
So absolutely. The thing, in my opinion, you've got two things that really make Montaillou tick that everything else rests upon. I think the first is that it is remote, right? And boy, you can do remote in literally any setting, any genre, right? Yeah. In science fiction, hey, guess what? It's a remote space station, where everybody knows everybody's business and paranoia, and blah, blah, blah. The other thing is the Cathar business, which at first blush, like, how are you going to port that? It doesn't have to be religious, right? Strip out the religious element, and in science fiction, replace it with a political element or an economic element, where you know, these guys, the village or space station in this instance, used to be hardcore in favor of this particular star empire, or used to be hardcore space Marxist, or some other kind of political affiliation. And now you have this new, much more powerful political affiliation that's coming in and is starting to do inquisitions and investigations and so forth. But you're still very far from the seat of that power. And what's great about that, and frankly, in any genre, I would recommend changing it from Catholic Cathar. Make the ideological component, whether it's religious or economic or political or philosophical or whatever, make the ideological component something that at least one of your player characters has buy-in about, right? So if you're playing Warhammer 40K, using the Wrath and Glory rule set or whatever, cool. Probably one of your characters is an Imperial Inquisitor, or in some other way has a dog in some ideological fight. Cool. Have the ideological dispute be about the thing that PC already cares about, because then you don't even have to do the thing about like, oh, you accidentally picked a side and now you're embroiled. Like, you already picked a side before you even got here. Like, as soon as you arrive, you are embroiled. And you have enemies and you have allies. And yeah, that's what I strongly recommend, is make the ideological component an ideology that at least one of your PCs is already strongly in favor of or strongly against. And boy, if you can pull it off, wouldn't it be great to have it be an ideological dispute that's already present in the party, right? So if you've got, a cleric of the good and nice people and a necromancer of the bad undead people who are, reluctantly coexisting in the party, like, cool, have that be the dispute that's tearing Montaillou apart. Now your players are really invested.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do like the idea of a space station, because the idea of, being in kind of a cramped space and knowing everybody's business or being able to spy on everybody. It's just like, there are always going to be vents and, things like that where, or small corridors where people can overhear people. I think that would be really, really interesting, and maybe hasn't been played with, or at least I've forgotten about that elements when I run some science fiction. I'll have to remember that the next time I'm running some science fiction, to say that the space station, everybody's spying on everybody in the space station because they can, the air vent like leads right into the next person's, quarters or whatever it is. And then, I did really like that idea there at the end with the kind of the ideological kind of component, making kind of a rift in the party, or at least just being, making somebody choose sides, or making one member of the party try to convince everybody to say, all right, we've got to go along with this because this is like, my whole backstory and stuff. I think that would really lend itself to some really, really good character moments. All right. Well, what has that been, like 45 minutes on the Spy-Infested village? All right. We foolishly each time pick 3 topics and try to get through those within, I guess, like an hour and 20 minutes. But anyway, so I think there's a ton of game material there. We have 2 other topics. I guess one here, we're going to look at a grimoire, and there's Olympic spirits. What is going on with Olympic spirits in a grimoire?
Yeah, so this grimoire, after previously doing like, let me just fluff my feathers, show that I can do a French accent. Now let me just completely butcher this Latin pronunciation. Arbatel de magia veturum translates as Arbatel, of the magic of the ancients.
And if listeners note, I usually let Tristan pronounce all of these names.
Smart.
Yeah.
So this is a 16th century Swiss grimoire. Grimoire is a book of magic, and obviously leading with the standard thing like, hey, we're treating this as folklore, right? Like magic isn't real, Olympic spirits aren't real, but they can be in your game.
Absolutely.
So this grimoire supposedly it presents itself as the revelations offered by an angel named Arbatel unto the author. And this angel, who is, of course, a good godly being, wanted to offer this knowledge to the author of the grimoire as a sort of godly Christian magic. Not, the awful Satan magic of the witches or whatever, but like, no, this is magic God wants you to have. Be a good occultist. And it has a bunch of stuff in it, but what we're here to talk about is the Olympic spirits. And Olympic spirits have, to a certain extent, I believe, gotten ingrained in New Age stuff these days. But this 16th century grimoire seems to be the first place where the idea appears. And what these Olympic spirits are is they are natural spirits of the heavens, which can be summoned and commanded just like demons. And just like demons, if you handle it badly, they can be very dangerous to you. So I guess don't do that. And the idea is that these Olympic spirits, they live in the firmament, right? They live in the stars. And they allot destinies. They hand out destinies to everybody. And if you are a good, godly magician, you can summon them and ask them to do things for you. And the way you summon them is You have to know their name, right? You have to know the actual name of the spirit you're trying to summon. And then you ask God very politely, please send me the spirit named such and such. I'm going to ask him to do this and that. And then God will do you a solid and have the Olympic spirit appear before you. The author does warn you, don't let the spirit stay for more than an hour, but the author does not tell us what happens if you go over deadline. But you have to be careful, right? Because sometimes demons will appear in the place of these spirits and they will try to trick you. And sometimes the spirits will try to lie to you. And if you're not a godly man, you will fall for the lies. Only good Christians can see through the lies. And the question then is like, okay, this really seems a lot like demonology, but with a nice Christian coat of paint on it to make it acceptable to a 16th century audience. Like, what is their deal? And the deal is that these aren't spirits from hell. They are sky spirits. They are space spirits. Because the Olympic spirits, they're divided into a hierarchical organization, 186 provinces grouped into 7 governments. And then in each of the governments, you've got kings and princes and dukes and ministers and familiars and messengers. But each government is headed by a governor. And that governor is a planet. Planet in the 16th century sense of a wandering star, not necessarily in the sense of, it's a thing that orbits the sun that you can stand on. And the Arbatel author seems to think that you would only ever want to speak to one of the governors, right? To one of the 7 big guys. Offers no advice for if you want to speak to anybody lower ranked. Each of these big guys, each of these governors has an association with a particular day of the week. You're only supposed to summon an Olympic spirit on its relevant day. No word on what happens if you summon it on a different day. And something that I think is really cool, there is, among the 7 governors, one of them is the chief governor, right? One of them is in charge of the other 6. But which one is in charge rotates every 490 years. So every 490 years, kind of one of them takes off the crown and passes it to the next guy, securing the knowledge that, 7 rotations from now, he will get the crown back. And what that means then is that each of these spirits, in addition to being associated with a particular planet and a particular day of the week, is also associated with a particular period of history, right? So you've got, one of them is associated kind of with the Bronze Age past, and one of them is associated with the Middle Ages, and one of them is the guy in charge right now, and then one of them is like the far future spirit. And I just think that's a really cool thing. Yeah. Each of them has particular powers and gifts that they can bestow. Some of these gifts are more useful than others. One of them can turn people hairy, which okay, now you have more hair. Thanks for the gift, buddy, I guess.
Worse superpowers, I guess.
Yes. But then you've got others who can, prolong your lifespan to 700 years. And bestow great wisdom and convert anything into gold and other kind of more standard alchemical occult sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. One final thing I'll mention, I'm not going to get into defining each of the 7. They're frankly somewhat interchangeable. I think the concept is more interesting than the actual details. But one final thing I'll mention here is that most of them have some mega super gift that they can offer. But the mega super gift is conditional on you already being a good person. So, for example, the true name of the sun and guy in charge of Tuesday, chief governor 920 to 1409 AD, can make you be worshipped as a god by all of the kings of the world. But he can only do that if you're already dignified. And so there's kind of this catch that the Arbatel author builds into it, along with all this other kind of Christian occultism that's like, but only do this if you're a good person, because if you're a bad person, you can't get the super mega superpowers. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think you're right. The concept is very interesting, and it could form kind of an interesting framework to run a campaign in, or to introduce it into your campaign. Of course, that last kind of bit there about being a good person. If you're concerned about your group being a little sketchy, you can always have the guys show up and say, well, I could make you be worshipped by all the kings, but you'd have to be good first. And since you're not, it's no longer Tuesday or whatever, and the gift is passed. But that might be mean, but I was just thinking that there's a lot of different things that you could do with this. What were some of your kind of main ideas when you first started thinking of, like how would you introduce this in the beginning, or introduce this at somewhere along the line in your campaign, or just kind of pick and choose some elements out of it?
So for me, I would use these guys kind of in a way very similar to extraplanar entities in D&D. Right? That to a certain extent, like these 7 dudes are just like 7 more entries in the monster manual, not necessarily in terms of fighting them, but in terms of they're like major powerful NPCs that you can choose to interact with if you so desire. And I would lean heavily into the caveats, the cautions that the author adds about how, like, they will try to lie to you, and you better be a good Christian, otherwise you're going to fall for their lies. And if you fall for their lies, like, bad things are going to happen to you. I would lean into that heavily. And, the author is kind of all like, oh, but, this is the good magic. This isn't the good magic. Have this be, no, it's they are all liars, right? They're all trying to pull one over on you. And all of their offers are conditional, right? That, like, sure, I will absolutely teach you the true medicine, but in exchange, I'm going to have to ask you to do this thing for me first. And that then is kind of a fun little Faustian bargain, but a fun little Faustian bargain that isn't self-evidently a bad idea, right? Like, making a deal with the devil, bad idea in just about every setting. Making a deal with a weird sky spirit, like, okay, let's talk about this, I guess. Like, is this a bad idea? Is the thing that he's asking me to do really bad? But of course, depending on what kind of campaign you're running, you could have it kind of come out in the end that all the things they've been asking you to do are ultimately bad. And one final thing that really jumped out at me about these guys is I think they're really well suited to a space opera. That obviously you can't do this in hard science fiction, but the idea that you have these, like, spirits of the planets, and planets in this case includes the sun and the moon, but you have these spirits of the planets, but you're in space. Like, the planets are real places that you can really visit. And if you were going to have some, space entities already, I think that these guys offer some really interesting color that's going to feel really unique and different at the table. And I guess that's kind of the central thing that I'm trying to get at with all this yammering is none of this is truly different from what you were already doing, but what it is it's a very different flavoring. It's going to feel different at the table, and I think your players will appreciate that.
Yeah. No, I think that's right on. I think it was a very interesting read on your blog, and it was just some just like you said, just a number of different ways you can take it. And also it gives a little different flavor than something maybe that, players have experienced before. And like you were saying, like kind of a space fantasy or a science fantasy game where people are hopping to different planets, having a controlling spirit of the planet or of stars, that could really lead into a very interesting game, to where planets and stars are maybe essentially using, beings like the players and different things as, proxies in their, I don't know, age old wars and conflicts, or, espionages, waiting for the next person to get the throne and putting things into place before they change crowns again or something. I think there is a lot of material there that could really add a different flavor to a campaign.
And I will confess, I am an absolute sucker for the trope of celestial bodies as intelligent beings and intelligent agents. That is something that I am always down for. Yeah,
absolutely. I remember the old TV show, Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda. All the stars were sentient beings, and they actually had avatars that they're humanoid avatars that walked among the people and just interacted and just did things alongside other humanoids. And people were unaware of them until some great big, large cosmic scale events were taking place, and they were manipulating and putting people and resources into different places because of this kind of conflict between them. And I always thought that was a really brilliant idea. And I've never used it in a game, but I don't know why I haven't, because that would be awesome.
I definitely ran a year-long campaign once where the final big bad was a particular star, and the star had been manipulating things from behind the scenes for this whole time. And I had a lot of fun with it. It was a lot of fun for me as the GM. For the players, to be honest, I'm not sure if they were like, yeah, okay, like it's a star. Like it could have just as easily been anything else. But I had a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, I bet, because that sounds awesome. I would have loved that. That sounds awesome. But yeah, who knows?
Who knows? And
sometimes players are like, oh, yeah, I've seen that, been there before. And you're like, come on, man, that was pretty creative.
It did let me do some different things with like, instead of you come upon, the weird occult laboratory or whatever, like instead it was, and then you find the observatory, right? Or the place where the amateur cultist has built himself a little platform in a tree from which he can observe the stars. And so it did lend things a little bit of a different flavor that I had fun with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is awesome. I mean, there's always the kind of dark and gloomy place, or the, even in a modern setting, the dark and gloomy warehouse. I always think it's interesting when you can put it into some other place. Having the players go to an observatory, or even if you're running a modern game, they have to go to like I forget where one of the big observatories is. I think there's one in Perth or something, in Australia. There's a huge observatory. You could go there and just, because the sun is up to something or whatever.
We'll get you, son.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what you're going to do against it, but hey, there you go. I mean, it sounds like a lot of fun. I think you can go a lot of different ways with that. All right. So our last one, as always, we're going over a bit, but the next one we want to talk about was scholarly NPCs kind of drawn from history. Why don't you set this one up and we can talk about a couple ideas that you had here.
Yeah, so we'll talk first briefly about the source. The source is this book called Aubrey's Brief Lives. John Aubrey was this British country aristocrat fellow in the 1600s, and he had an ambition to write biographies of the great men of his age. And that was his pet project that he actually never got around to. But what he did instead was John Aubrey went to a lot of parties. And so every time he was at these parties, he would gather all of the gossip that he could, and then he would come home and he would write it all down, right? And you can imagine this like, oh, fancy country gentleman stumbling home from his coach, absolutely plastered, stumbling upstairs to his study, writing down all of the scurrilous rumors he heard that night, and then passing out. And he just did this for his entire life. And he never actually got around to assembling his rumors into a book. And so when he died, he left behind this giant stack of papers full of rumors. And this stack of papers has since been curated and edited in various ways, and usually published under the title Brief Lives or Aubrey's Brief Lives, because what it ultimately is just collections of microbiographies of powerful and important people, almost universally men, who, but with a focus on the really weird and colorful stuff that usually doesn't make it into sober biography. So I've picked out a couple of kind of scholarly figures. One of the things actually that's really fun about Aubrey is when you read it, you're not getting, the official neutral or attempting to be objective, whatever. Like, this is one man's vision, one man who was alive at the time, and his vision of what he thought was interesting and what he thought was worth writing down and who he thought was worth writing down. And that then creates this really idiosyncratic view of this wild and colorful era, because this is the era with the English Civil Wars. This is the era with the execution of Charles I. This is a really chaotic period in British history. And you've got John Aubrey over here who's just like, I write down whatever I think is interesting. And so he's got a lot of stuff that we think of as more Elizabethan, because a lot of these guys were alive. They were at the ends of their lives when Aubrey was writing. So even though they were doing interesting things in the previous era, Aubrey's still around to write them down. So he's got an entry in there about William Shakespeare. And you read Aubrey's microbiography of William Shakespeare and you don't recognize the man, right? This isn't the guy we all learned about in grade school. This is because Aubrey never even mentions that Shakespeare wrote tragedies. He gives some brief mentions to the comedies. He only mentions one by name, and mostly he's interested in Shakespeare's poetry. And even more than that, he's interested in Shakespeare being friends with some other authors that Aubrey thought were actually worth writing about. Anyway, it's super idiosyncratic. But let's talk about some scholarly figures from Aubrey. The first guy I'm going to bring up is Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh, of course, is from that previous era. He's from that Elizabethan era, but he did live until 1618, and so Aubrey writes about him. And we know Sir Walter Raleigh as this, kind of military commander and adventurer. He helped found the first Virginia colony. He fought for England and France and Ireland and Spain and Guyana and blah, blah, blah. And he was a big favorite of Queen Elizabeth. But according to Aubrey, Sir Walter Raleigh was also a chemist. And whenever he was on one of these long sea voyages, he would bring along with him a bunch of chemistry books and presumably chemistry equipment, because he had to have something to do to pass the time. And so he did his chemistry while out and about. And later in life, when he was imprisoned in the Tower of London, he used his skill in chemistry to try to fake leprosy. He tried to give himself the symptoms of leprosy, so the guards would be like, "Oh, we don't need to execute this guy. Let's put him in the low security, whatever," and then he could escape. But it didn't work. A doctor came in, and a doctor was like, "No, I don't think this guy's got leprosy. He's in any case, he's healthy enough to move. So no big deal. It came to naught. One other thing about Sir Walter Raleigh is, of course, Aubrey mentions that he spoke with a very thick Devon or Devonshire accent. And of course, accents change over time, so this is a little anachronistic, but for a modern Devon accent, most of you fine folks at home would probably recognize it as being a pirate accent, because a Devonshire accent is very similar to a Dorset accent. And a Dorset accent is the accent that actor Robert Newton exaggerated in the 1950 Treasure Island, the, "Arr, you shiver me timbers" sort of accent that has since become, the pirate accent. And so I love the idea of this, this chemical adventurer traveling all over the world, getting up to, chemistry-based hijinks while talking like a pirate, that I think is very silly. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I'll also mention, just in the same chemistry vein, Robert Boyle. You might remember his Boyle's law of how gases work from high school chemistry. But because Boyle was writing in an era where scientific discoveries were often kept very close to the chest, Boyle wound up being kind of the scientific spy master. Where he kind of maintained informants out in Europe who would notify him when, like, "Oh, this guy, I think he discovered something new about gases." And Boyle would try to snatch up the discovery and buy it. So I think you can just, if you're doing a kind of a chemistry adventurer NPC, in addition to all this, the stuff we talked about with Walter Raleigh, I would fold in that kind of scientific spy master thing that Boyle has going on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And definitely something that, like, I had never really thought about. So that would be a really unique NPC. I think this kind of leans into all of what we talk about each time, is that history is so interesting and so fascinating that it just doesn't run out of stuff, right? Like Sir Walter Raleigh, like, not only does he make a good player character, he'd make a fantastic NPC. I mean, or now that you were just saying, like, a scientific spy master who is like collecting scientific knowledge. I mean, you could switch it to magic knowledge, magic items or whatever. I mean, and it works fantastically. And it's something that I don't know if I've ever seen in a game. So I think it's great.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there are a number of others, but for the sake of time, we'll cut them down. People can go to moltensulfur.com and read.
Before we leave,
sure.
Can I just real quick mention these final two dudes, because they're too much fun.
Okay.
So William Harvey was the anatomist who came up with the idea that the heart is a pump that circulates blood throughout the body, right? People had kind of proto ideas of this, but Harvey was the first guy who kind of put it all together, demonstrated that, yes, in fact, the same blood goes throughout the body and it is pumped by the heart. And I have experimental evidence to support it. And Aubrey gives us a bunch of little details about Harvey that, like, this dude was a vampire. He loved dissecting frogs and toads. He wrote a book about insects. These are, animals that are
creatures of the night. Yes. Yeah,
they're creatures of the night, right? They're associated with vampires and stuff. He loved to live in the dark. He, and I'm quoting Aubrey here, did delight to be in the dark, and told me he could then best contemplate. He had a house heretofore at Combe in Surrey, a good air and prospect, where he had caves made in the earth. He liked stabbing people with a dagger. He was very violent. Like, this dude's a vampire, right? Like, he's a blood scientist who is a vampire. That's how he knows so much about blood. And then you have this lame loser counterpart to William Harvey, a guy named Walter Warner, who felt that he had discovered the circulation of the blood before Harvey, but that he was denied credit. Like, I discovered this first, and everybody talks about Harvey and nobody talks about me. And of course, there's absolutely no evidence to support this. Like, he didn't, right? Like, I'm just sorry, bro. Like, you wrote some stuff that contained no new information, and then Harvey comes along and makes a big discovery, and you're like, well, I was tangentially associated with that. Nobody gives me any credit. You know, I'm just as good as Harvey. So I just love the idea that you have like this vampire blood scientist, and who's your best ally in your war against the vampire blood scientist? Well, this bitter loser who just wants credit for something he didn't do.
Yeah, well, like I said, I mean, people from history are just so fascinating. But the guy who likes to be in the dark and has caves so he can think better in the dark, that is not only, yes, is he a vampire? I mean, this is playing creepy in real life. Like, I don't know what this guy's doing, you know, creeping around down there, thinking about blood all the time. I don't know. That's pretty crazy. And then, yes, the person who wants all the credit for something. And obviously, I think you can see just really quickly how you can take a lot of these in some interesting directions and give NPCs what we kind of always crave, right? We need personality in an NPC, right? Because, you know, how many times during a session or something that you're just kind of caught and you're just like, oh, well, I made up an NPC, but he's just nothing, you know, there's just nothing to him or her or anything. And you're just like, oh, that was kind of a bland NPC. Well, here now you have like a whole treasure trove that you can just give them all kinds of quirks and personality and make them unforgettable, because who's going to forget the blood scientist that, you know, hangs out in caves, you know, like nobody's going to forget that guy. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will mention, by the way, by the time this episode drops, so we talked about four different NPCs essentially from Aubrey. By the time this episode drops, I'll have 3 different blog posts up with NPCs from Aubrey, totaling, I want to say 30 to 40 different NPCs. So if you like these 4, you know, come on back for the 35 other guys and stick them just right into your campaign. File the serial numbers off of them and go to town.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we've been talking about, I mean, it works in fantasy, it works in modern day. I mean, you could work it into a science fiction campaign as well. So anybody out there who's running a game, I think you can use some of these aspects and really just add something to their, and, you know, to your NPCs and really make some, you know, memorable moments for your characters. I think that's just incredible. And like I was starting to say a bit ago, you can, if you want to read more, definitely check out moltensulfur.com. And is there anything else you're working on or anything, Tristan? You had mentioned Shanty Hunters and stuff at the beginning. And Molten Sulfur, I guess, is the main place where you want to direct everybody?
Yeah, Molten Sulfur blog at moltensulfur.com is definitely where I want to direct people. The big project, honestly, that I'm working on right now is I'm overhauling the blog. I want to make the blog I want to make the blog's archive much more usable. I want to make the back catalog much more searchable and much more filterable, because at this point, as we're recording, I've got 230 posts on the blog, and I really want you as a GM to be able to say, oh, geez, what I really need tonight is I need a memorable NPC. I need this particular kind of adventure. I want it to be possible for you to just go to the Molten Sulfur blog, you know, type in a relevant keyword into the search field, filter it down by era or by location or by theme or you know, a variety of different stuff, and just like get exactly the thing that you needed for tonight. So that's the big thing I'm working on right now. I can't promise that by the time this episode drops that it will be out and ready, but that's honestly where I'm kind of devoting my extra effort right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds awesome. And as always, I will have links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening can head over there and find moltensulfur.com and some of Tristan's games and books. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for stopping by again.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Matt. Always a delight.
All right, there you have it, guys. Oh, man, I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Tristan today. We always talk about some fascinating situations and events from history that you can do so much with. I love our conversations, and I love the history that Tristan brings each and every time. And I know that these episodes really help game masters and role players. So, as always, if you want to check out what Tristan is up to, his role-playing games, his blog, tons and tons of articles about fascinating history and how to make them gameable, you can find those links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. Check it out. All right, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 20 free dungeon maps, a custom character background. You'll never miss an episode of this show, and each and every Friday, you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on in the world of Dice Geeks. All right, now guys, if you want to support the show in some way, you can do so by heading over to patreon.com/dicegeeks. Most appreciated if you would check that out. Now, as always, I thank you so much for listening, and until next Wednesday, keep gaming!